I was sitting in my bedroom, headphones on, pretending everything was normal when I heard the knock on the door. Not a casual knock, not a friend stopping by. It was the kind of knock that changes everything. The kind that echoes through your entire life and splits it into before and after. I didn't know it then, but that knock at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon was going to take my home away from me. Not because my family wanted to leave, not because we were moving to something better, but because the bank had decided we didn't deserve to stay. I'm 17 now, and I'm sharing this story because I know there are so many people out there, right now at this very moment, who are experiencing what my family experienced. Some of you watching this might be living through it right now. Maybe you're a teenager like I was, watching your parents stress about bills and hearing conversations through paper-thin walls that you weren't supposed to hear. Maybe you're a parent trying to figure out how you're going to keep your family housed. Maybe you're sitting in a school classroom, a coffee shop, or your bed right now, thinking that your situation is hopeless, that there's no way forward, that your story is going to end in tragedy. I'm here to tell you something that my dad taught me during the hardest year of our lives. Your story doesn't have to end the way you're afraid it will. What happened to my family, and what my dad did next, not only saved us from homelessness, but it transformed everything. It changed how we thought about money, about failure, about what family really means, and about what's actually possible when you refuse to give up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began. I grew up in a 3-bedroom suburban home in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood. You know the kind. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors who waved from their driveways, a community pool, good schools. My parents bought the house when I was just a baby, and for the first 16 years of my life I thought that house was my forever home. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. My dad worked in construction management. He had a solid job, or at least that's what I understood from the dinner table conversations I half listened to while scrolling through my phone. My mom worked part-time at a dental office. Between the two of them they provided for us 3 kids. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. We were comfortable. We were middle class. We were the kind of family that belonged in a house like ours. Or at least that's what I thought. I had no idea, at 16 years old, that my parents had been struggling for months. Looking back now, I can see the signs I completely missed because I was too busy being a teenager. The careful way my mom would check the mailbox before my dad got home. The hushed conversations in their bedroom with the door closed. The way my dad would come home later and later from work, saying he was following up on things, but I now know he was probably driving around, trying to figure out how to solve a problem that felt impossible. The housing market had crashed hard. My dad's work had started to slow down as construction projects were being cancelled or postponed. He was still working, but not as many hours, not as many jobs. My parents had taken out a mortgage they thought they could handle, but when the economy shifted, suddenly the numbers didn't work anymore. Every month got tighter. Every month felt harder. But I didn't know this. I was worried about homecoming. I was stressed about which college I wanted to apply to. I was concerned about whether this boy in my calculus class might ask me to the fall dance. I was living a completely normal teenage life while my parents were drowning. That's what makes the next part even harder to talk about. The feeling that maybe if I had paid attention, if I had been less self-absorbed, if I had been the kind of daughter who noticed her parents' pain, maybe I could have done something. Maybe things would have been different. My therapist told me that wasn't a helpful way to think about it, that I was a kid and it wasn't my job to save my family. But those thoughts still visit me sometimes, especially late at night. Anyway, everything felt normal to me in those months leading up to the knock. My family had dinner together on most nights. We laughed, we watched movies, we argued about stupid things like the television remote and what to order for pizza. We drove to my soccer games and my brother's debate competitions and my little sister's volleyball matches. We went to church on Sundays. We visited my grandparents. We did all the normal things that families do. And then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was in my room when I heard the doorbell ring. I remember because I was procrastinating on a history essay that was due the next day. I had my earbuds in, listening to some music I probably shouldn't have been listening to, and I was mostly just staring at my laptop screen instead of writing anything productive. My little sister, Emma, who was 13 at the time, went downstairs to answer the door. Emma has always been the friendly one in our family, the one who opens the door with a smile and never suspects that anything bad might be on the other side of it. I heard voices downstairs. One was Emma's, The others were men's voices, professional voices. There was something about the tone of them that made me pause my music and listen. I heard Emma call out for my mom. My mom was in the kitchen, I think, or maybe she was in the laundry room. She always seemed to be doing laundry back then, constantly trying to keep everything together, to keep the household running smoothly as the world around us was falling apart. I heard her footsteps. I heard the front door close. Then there was silence. I should have gone downstairs, I should have been curious. But instead I put my earbuds back in and tried to get back to my essay. I remember telling myself it was probably just someone selling something, or maybe it was a delivery, or maybe it was someone from my mom's work. I didn't have any premonition. I didn't feel anything shift in the universe. I just went back to typing sentences that I would probably delete anyway. My mom came upstairs about 15 minutes later. She knocked on my door and asked me to come downstairs. There was something in her voice that made me pull out my earbuds, something that made me close my laptop and follow her without questioning why. Downstairs, my dad was already home. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 hours. My brother Marcus, who was 18, was sitting on the couch with his backpack still on, which meant he had just gotten home from his college classes. My mom sat down next to my dad, and I remember my dad's face. I remember that expression. It was the face of a man who had been trying to hold something together for a very long time and had finally run out of strength. The men at the door had been from the bank. They had delivered the foreclosure notice. We had 30 days to vacate the house. I don't remember if I cried immediately or if the tears came later. I don't remember what anyone said after my dad explained what was happening. I do remember the word that kept repeating in my head, impossible. This was impossible. People lost their homes, that happened to other people. People on the news, people in different neighborhoods. People we read about in the economics section of the newspaper. Not us, not our family. My mom reached over and put her hand on my dad's arm. Emma started crying. Marcus, who was usually the one with all the answers, looked like someone had just knocked the wind out of him. And my dad just kept explaining the details in this calm, measured voice, like he was reading from a manual about how to deliver devastating news to your family. We had 30 days, he would talk to a lawyer, maybe there were options. Maybe this wasn't necessarily the end. He was already looking into other places we could rent, we would figure this out, we had to figure this out. I remember thinking that those last 3 words were maybe the scariest thing he said all day. Because they implied that there was a chance we might not figure it out, that there was a possibility that figuring it out could be impossible. The days after the foreclosure notice were unlike anything I had ever experienced. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been through it. It's not just about losing a house. It's about losing the framework that your entire sense of security is built on. For 16 years I had walked into the same front door. I had sat at the same kitchen table for dinner. I had fallen asleep in the same bedroom every single night. That home wasn't just where I lived. It was who I was. It was the address I gave when someone asked where I was from. It was the place I brought my friends after school. It was the backdrop of every memory I had from early childhood to the present moment. And suddenly it was going to be gone. The hardest part was seeing how the foreclosure notice changed my parents. My mom had always been the organized one, the planner, the one who kept things running smoothly. But after the notice, she seemed to move in slow motion. She would start doing a task and then just sort of stop in the middle of it and stare at nothing. I would find her sitting on the living room couch with her phone in her hand, but she wasn't actually doing anything with the phone. She was just sitting there, holding it, not looking at it. My dad became almost the opposite. He became hyperactive in a way. He was always on his laptop, always on his phone, always trying to work on something. He'd stay up late into the night researching, making calls, trying to figure out what options we had. I would hear him in the office at midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, working on something that he hoped might save us. It was like watching 2 different people go through 2 different versions of a crisis. My mom was shutting down. My dad was fighting. And Emma and Marcus and I were just trying to keep our heads above water in the middle of all of it. School became strange. I couldn't concentrate. I would sit in class and the teacher would be explaining some concept about photosynthesis or the French Revolution or calculus derivatives, and I couldn't make myself care. All I could think about was that we might not have a home. All I could think about was where we would go. Would we live in an apartment? Would we have to share rooms? Would people at school find out? That fear was almost as bad as the foreclosure itself. The fear that this would become known. That people would find out that my family couldn't hold onto our house, that we had failed in some way that the world would see and judge us for. I had friends who were wealthy. Their families didn't worry about money. Their parents drove nice cars and talked about vacation homes and investment portfolios. What would those friends think if they knew that my family was losing everything? What would they say? I didn't tell anyone. I just went to school every day and pretended that everything was fine. I did my homework. I went to soccer practice. I sat at lunch with my friends and laughed at their jokes and made comments about the cute boys in our grade and never, not even once, mentioned the fact that my family was facing homelessness. Marcus handled it differently. He just kind of removed himself from the situation. He was already living part-time at college anyway, and after the notice came, he just spent more and more time there. I think part of it was that he genuinely had classes and studying to do, but part of it was also that he couldn't stand to be in the house anymore. He couldn't stand the sadness and the stress and the weight of the crisis. So he just removed himself from it as much as he could. Emma, my little sister, became clingy. She would seek out my mom and my dad constantly. She wanted physical affection. She wanted to be held. She wanted reassurance. And my parents, despite everything they were going through, did their best to give it to her. But I could see how draining it was for them. How much energy they were expending to be strong for her when they were falling apart on the inside. And me, I think I turned inward. I stopped going out as much. I stopped texting with my friends as much. I stopped participating in as many activities. I just kind of retreated into myself and tried to process what was happening in my own head. My dad did try to sit me down and talk to me about it a few days after the notice came. He wanted to explain what had happened to make me understand that it wasn't about mismanagement or poor planning. It was about circumstances beyond our control. The economy had crashed, his work had slowed down, the mortgage had become unaffordable, bad timing, bad luck. A system that was stacked against people like us. I remember him saying something like, "We did everything right, sweetheart. We paid our bills, we worked hard. We saved what we could. Sometimes that just isn't enough in this world, and that's not fair, but it's the truth." I remember wanting to make him feel better, wanting to say that it would be okay, that we'd figure it out, that I wasn't scared. But I couldn't do it. I was too scared to pretend that everything was going to be fine, so instead I just hugged him and cried. That was probably one of the most honest moments of that entire ordeal. Just a dad and his daughter, scared out of their minds, holding on to each other because there was nothing else to do. My dad did exactly what he said he would do. He talked to a lawyer. There was a consultation, which my dad paid for with money he could not really afford to spend, but he had to know what our options were. The lawyer explained the foreclosure process in terms that were legal and technical and ultimately very depressing. There might be a way to fight it, but it would require proof that the bank had made an error in the loan process. It would require documentation and evidence and time and money. And even then, the chance of success was very low. Most foreclosures went through exactly as planned. There might be a loan modification program, but those were also difficult to get approved for and often didn't work out the way people hoped. There was the option of trying to sell the house, but given the state of the market and the amount of money we owed on the mortgage versus what the house might be worth, that probably wouldn't help us either. The lawyer's bottom line was that we had 30 days, and we needed to start looking for a place to rent. That was the most realistic path forward. My dad came home after that consultation looking even more defeated than before. The hope that maybe there was some legal way out had died with that consultation. Now it was real. Now it was concrete. Now it was something we couldn't avoid or wish away. He sat down with my mom and they started looking at rental listings online. I would sometimes catch them doing this late at night, after Emma had gone to bed. They would look at apartments and townhouses and rental homes in our area and in some areas outside our area. And I could see them trying to figure out what we could afford, what would work for our family, what was available in the timeline we had. It was depressing. Everything was so much smaller than our house. Everything was so much more expensive. Everything required references and background checks and proof of income, which were all difficult things to prove when the primary breadwinner in the family had just experienced significant job loss. I remember my mom saying to my dad, "How are we going to convince a landlord to rent to us when we're literally losing our home because we can't pay for it?" And my dad didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at the laptop screen and said nothing. Something happened during those weeks after the foreclosure notice that I didn't talk about for a very long time. Something that made me understand the power of shame and how it can eat you up from the inside. One day at school, I was sitting in the cafeteria at lunch with my friends. We were in the middle of discussing plans for the weekend. Some of the girls wanted to go to the mall, some wanted to go see a movie. Someone suggested going to someone's house to hang out. And then one of my friends, let's call her Jennifer, said, "We could go to my house. My parents are doing some renovations in our living room this weekend, so we could all hang out up in the game room. It's huge." My dad had it professionally done last year. This was Jennifer, whose parents were wealthy, whose house was one of those perfect houses in one of those perfect neighborhoods, whose biggest problem was probably that she had too many options instead of too few. And I felt this surge of something. Was it anger? Was it jealousy? Was it sadness? Was it all of those things combined? I couldn't quite name it, but it filled me up and I had to excuse myself from the table because I felt like I was going to cry in front of everyone. I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall and just sat there for a while, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Why was I so angry at Jennifer? She hadn't done anything to me. Her parents having money wasn't her fault. Her house being nice wasn't her fault. The fact that she got to have a normal life with normal problems wasn't her fault. But in that moment, I hated her for it. Or more accurately, I hated my circumstances so much that I was projecting it onto her. That was the moment I realized how much I was starting to feel ashamed of what was happening to my family. Not ashamed in a rational way, like we had done something wrong. But ashamed in that deep, cellular way that makes you want to hide, that makes you not want to be seen. I couldn't tell my friends that my family was losing our house. I couldn't talk to them about the foreclosure or the stress or the fear of not knowing where we were going to live. Not because they would judge me necessarily, though I worried that they would, but because it felt like it would make it more real. Like saying it out loud would make everyone realize that I was different from them, that my family was different, that something was fundamentally wrong with us in a way that something wasn't wrong with them. The shame made me want to disappear. It made me want to isolate even more. It made me feel like I was less than, like I was somehow smaller or lesser than the people around me. And I think that's something that people who haven't experienced financial crisis don't always understand. It's not just about not having money. It's about the social consequences of not having money. It's about the way that financial struggles can make you feel like you're broken in some way. Like you don't belong. Like there's something inherently wrong with you. My dad talked to me about this shame actually once he figured out what I was feeling. He said something that I've never forgotten. He said, "Sweetheart, there is no shame in struggling. There is no shame in not having enough. The only shame would be in giving up, and we're not going to give up." I didn't believe him at the time. I was too deep in my own feelings of embarrassment and inadequacy. But I held on to those words anyway, because I thought maybe someday they would make sense to me. Okay, so this is the part of the story where things actually started to change. This is where my dad went from just trying to manage the crisis to actually doing something that transformed everything for us. My dad sat down one evening, maybe 2 weeks after we got the foreclosure notice, and he told us he had been thinking about something. He said he'd been doing some research, and he wanted to talk to us about an idea. Now, my dad isn't the type of person to have radical ideas. He's a pretty practical, straightforward guy. He goes to work, he provides for his family, he doesn't take risks. But desperation, I think, does something to people. It makes them open to ideas they might not otherwise consider. The idea was this: what if he didn't try to fight the foreclosure? What if he didn't try to rent a new place? What if instead he got intentional about what he wanted to build for our family? He had been researching something called housing alternatives. He had been reading about tiny houses, about intentional communities, about multi-generational living situations, about people who had experienced financial crises, and had used it as an opportunity to completely reimagine how they wanted to live. And he had come up with a plan. Here's what he proposed. There was a piece of land in a different county about 45 minutes away that my grandparents owned. They had bought it years ago, thinking maybe they would build a vacation home there, but they never had. So for years it had just sat there undeveloped. My dad asked my grandparents if we could live there temporarily while we figured things out. My grandparents agreed immediately. They were horrified at the thought of our family becoming homeless and they wanted to help. So that part was solved. But here's where my dad's idea got creative, and honestly kind of brilliant. Instead of just moving to a temporary location and hoping things got better, instead of waiting around for the housing market to recover and trying to figure out how to afford another house, my dad came up with a plan to build something new. He wanted to build a small residential structure on my grandparents' land. Not a traditional house because he didn't have the money to build a traditional house, but something small, something affordable. Something that we could actually afford with the resources we had available. He started researching tiny houses. He looked into whether there were any programs that could help us. He talked to people who had done it. He ran the numbers over and over again. And he came up with a plan that seemed completely insane at first, but started to make sense the more we talked about it. The plan was this: we would sell almost everything we had, the extra vehicles, the furniture, anything that wasn't essential. We would take the money from that and combine it with some money that my grandparents were willing to gift us, and we would hire a team of people to help my dad build a small house on the land. It wouldn't be huge, but it would be ours. It wouldn't have a mortgage attached to it. It would be paid for, owned completely by us. And the timeline: my dad thought he could do it before the 30-day eviction deadline. I remember when he laid this out to us. I remember thinking he had completely lost his mind. Emma said out loud, "Dad, are you insane?" But my mom, after listening to the whole plan, asked him about the details. She asked him if he thought he could really do it in 30 days. She asked him what the building process would look like. She asked him what it would mean for the family. And somewhere in the middle of answering her questions, it became clear that he had actually thought this through, that he wasn't just spitballing, that he actually had a legitimate plan. My dad explained that he wouldn't be building the entire thing by himself. He had reached out to his network of people from construction and carpentry. He had found some people who were willing to help, partly for payment, partly because they wanted to support him. He had done some preliminary planning for a very small structure, something like 800 square feet, not huge, but livable for a family. He said, "We're not going to let this situation make us a victim. We're going to let this situation make us innovative. We're going to build something, and we're going to own it completely, and we're never going to be in a position like this again." Something shifted in the house after that conversation. It was like my dad's determination and refusal to accept defeat was contagious. If he was willing to try something radical and bold, then maybe we should be willing to support him in that effort. My mom threw herself into the project. She started helping with the logistics, the planning, the research. She started selling things. She had a yard sale on the weekends. She posted things on Facebook Marketplace. She called friends of friends to see if they wanted to buy furniture or electronics or anything else that we had accumulated over the years. Marcus came home from college for the rest of the month. He wasn't going to sit in an apartment while his family was dealing with a crisis. He came back and he helped with the construction. He helped with the selling of things. He helped with whatever needed to be helped with. Even Emma got involved. She created a social media account to post things we were selling. She decorated signs for the yard sale. She helped pack up boxes of things that were going to go. She was still scared, I think, but she was doing something which made the fear feel less overwhelming. And me, I was skeptical at first. I thought this was a doomed plan. I thought my dad was setting us up for disappointment. I thought the 30 days would pass and we would end up homeless anyway, and then we would also have wasted all this time and energy on something that didn't work. But I was also desperate. We were all desperate. And desperation makes you willing to try things you wouldn't normally try. I need to be honest about something, because I think this is the part of the story that people often gloss over. Building a house in 30 days, even a tiny house, is not a small undertaking. It requires sacrifice. It requires people to push themselves beyond what they thought they were capable of doing. It requires a level of commitment that goes beyond just showing up for a few hours here and there. My dad did not sleep much during those 30 days. I would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and I would hear him working in the yard. Not because it was convenient, but because there were only so many daylight hours and there was so much to do. He would work his regular job during the day and then he would work on the house at night. He would do this until he was exhausted, and then he would sleep for a few hours and then he would do it again. My mom was also working herself to the bone. She was holding down her job at the dental office and she was managing the logistics of the whole operation. She was handling the contractor stuff, dealing with the permitting issues, making sure the family was still eating and taken care of. She was the glue that held everything together. I saw my parents in a way I had never seen them before. I saw them fighting, not against each other but against the situation. I saw them at their limit and then seeing them push past their limit. I saw them doubting themselves and then choosing to keep going anyway. There were days when I wanted to tell them to stop. When I thought maybe we should just accept that this wasn't going to work and plan for something more realistic. But every time I even thought about saying that, I saw something in my dad's face that told me that giving up wasn't an option. That this wasn't just about building a house anymore. This was about refusing to be destroyed by circumstances. The construction was intense. My dad had brought in some of his friends from the construction industry. They worked fast. They worked efficiently. But fast and efficient still takes time when you're building something from scratch. There were issues, there were delays. There was the day that the materials didn't arrive on time and the whole schedule shifted. There was the day that a part of the structure didn't pass inspection and had to be redone. There were days when everything seemed like it was falling apart and it would be impossible to finish in time. But every time something went wrong, my dad would reassess, adjust, and keep moving forward. I started helping more. I know, I said earlier that I was skeptical. But somewhere around day 10 or 12 of the construction, I couldn't stay skeptical anymore. I couldn't sit on the sidelines and watch my parents kill themselves for this project, so I started helping. I would help with organizing materials. I would help with cleanup. I would help with anything I could do, even though I didn't have construction experience and I was mostly useless. But my presence mattered, I think. My willingness to participate in this crazy plan mattered. Marcus and I would sometimes work side by side. He had actual construction knowledge from things he had learned and seen, so he was more useful than me. But we were both there, both working, both refusing to let our parents do this alone. There's something about working towards something tangible with your family. There's something about building something, literally and figuratively. It changes the energy. Instead of being victims of a foreclosure, we became builders. We became people who were creating something instead of having something taken away from us. One of the most unexpected parts of this whole situation was how other people responded to what we were doing. I think my dad expected that people would think he was crazy. I expected that. But instead, something else happened. Word got out about what we were trying to do. I'm not sure exactly how, but somehow people in my dad's professional network found out. People started showing up. People who my dad knew from construction projects over the years started coming by to help. Sometimes they stayed for a few hours. Sometimes they stayed for a full day. Sometimes they just brought supplies or donated materials. There was this one contractor, Mr. Henderson, who had worked with my dad on several projects over the years. He came by one day and asked what my dad needed. My dad said something about needing some electrical work done, which was going to be expensive, and which he didn't have the money to pay for right now. Mr. Henderson said, "I'll do it, that's my gift to your family." This was thousands of dollars worth of electrical work. This man did it for free because he respected my dad and wanted to help. There were other people too. My mom's friends came by with food. They brought meals so that we wouldn't have to worry about cooking on days when we were all working on the house. My parents' church showed up one day with a whole group of people ready to work. They didn't know how to build a house necessarily, but they could show up and do the work that needed to be done. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with accepting help, especially American shame, which is so tied to independence and self-reliance. My dad struggled with it, I think. I could see it in the way he would thank people repeatedly, almost excessively, like he was trying to repay them with gratitude since he couldn't repay them with money. But my mom gently reminded him that he had helped people before, that this was how community worked, that the ability to accept help when you needed it was actually a strength, not a weakness. And he accepted it. He accepted the help and the generosity and the solidarity of all these people who showed up for us. I think that's another thing that people don't always understand about financial crisis. It can actually bring people together in beautiful ways. It reveals who actually cares about you versus who just likes you when things are easy. And it gives you an opportunity to be a part of something bigger than yourself. Some of my friends from school found out that we were building a tiny house. Some of them came to help, which was kind of amazing and kind of embarrassing at the same time. I think they wanted to support me, but I also think some of them were curious about what was happening. One girl, Alexis, came to help for an entire Saturday. She worked the whole time. She didn't just show up for the Instagram moment or whatever. She was genuinely there and genuinely helping. That meant something to me. It meant that not all of my friends were like Jennifer with her game room renovation. Some of them actually cared about things that mattered. Some of them had depth and compassion. As we got closer to the 30-day deadline, the pressure became almost unbearable. We were so close to finishing the structure, but there was still so much to do. Electrical work, plumbing, insulation, drywall, painting, flooring, the list went on and on. There were maybe 5 days left before the eviction date when I started to really believe that we might actually pull this off. The walls were up, the roof was on. The basic structure was solid. It was starting to look like a real house, not just a framework. But there was still an enormous amount of work to do to make it livable. My dad was operating on almost no sleep at this point. He was making decisions and directing work, and trying to prioritize what needed to be done first, so that we would have a functioning kitchen and bathrooms and bedrooms, and basic utilities, by the time we needed to move in. My mom was a wreck in a different way. She was stressed about the timeline, but she was also trying to make sure that the family was holding together emotionally. She was checking in on all of us. She was making sure we were eating enough and sleeping enough and not falling apart under the pressure. There was one night where my mom and I were sitting in the kitchen of our old house, the house that was about to stop being ours, and she just started crying. Like, really crying. Like all of the stress and fear and exhaustion of the past few weeks just came pouring out of her. I remember being 16 years old and realizing that I needed to be strong for her in that moment. I remember putting my arm around her and not saying anything because I didn't know what to say, but just being there for her. She told me later that she was scared, that she wasn't sure this was going to work, that she was terrified that we were going to fail and end up homeless, and that it would be my dad's fault for pushing this crazy plan instead of just accepting the reality of what was happening. I remember saying something like, "It's going to work, Mom. Dad knows what he's doing." I didn't actually know if it was going to work, but I said it anyway because I think my mom needed to hear it. She needed to hear someone say that we were going to be okay. The final few days before the eviction date were a blur of activity. I remember it in snapshots more than in a coherent timeline. I remember Marcus and my dad working through an entire night to get the electrical wiring done correctly so that it would pass inspection. I remember bringing them coffee at like 3 in the morning because I couldn't sleep anyway. I remember my mom on the phone with the county building inspector, asking if he could come do a final walkthrough one day early so that we would know if there were any issues we needed to fix before the actual deadline. I remember the inspector showing up, walking through the house that we had built, and asking my dad questions about the construction and the materials and the timeline. And when he was done, he looked at my dad and he said, "This is remarkable. You built this in less than a month." And my dad said, "We had to." And the inspector said, "Well, you did a good job, you're cleared to move in." I actually cried when I heard those words. We had done it, we had actually done it. The moving day itself was a weird kind of celebration and a weird kind of heartbreak. We were celebrating because we had accomplished something that seemed impossible. But we were also saying goodbye to the house that had been our home for 16 years. That was the place where I had my childhood. That was the place where I had felt safe and secure. There was also a sense of loss that I don't think we fully processed at that time. We had just experienced a major failure. My parents had fallen behind on a mortgage. We had lost a house. And yes, we had found a creative solution, but that didn't erase the original pain and disappointment. I remember walking through the house one last time before we left. I went upstairs to my bedroom and I just sat on the floor for a while. I sat in that empty room and I thought about all the times I had sat in that room before. All the times I had cried in there, or laughed in there, or done homework in there, or just existed in there as a normal teenager. And then I stood up and I walked out and I didn't look back. The tiny house was small, like genuinely small. 800 square feet for a family of 5 is not a lot of space. We were all on top of each other constantly. There was no privacy. There were no separate spaces where you could escape the family if you needed to. But something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling cramped and awful, it kind of felt nice. Because we were in such close quarters, we had to communicate. We had to work out conflicts quickly. We couldn't just retreat to separate corners of the house and avoid each other. We had to engage with each other. And honestly, I think that was good for us. My family became tighter. We had gone through something difficult together and we had survived it. We had actually thrived in some ways. We had done something that most people would have said was impossible. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from that. If we could survive a foreclosure and build a house in 30 days, then what else could we survive? The house itself was actually kind of beautiful. My dad had designed it thoughtfully. Every space served a purpose. There was no wasted space. The windows were positioned to let in natural light and to offer views of the nature around us. There was a big front porch where we could sit and see the land that my grandparents had owned for years but never really used. My little sister actually loved the tiny house. Emma, who had been so scared when the foreclosure first happened, seemed almost happy there. She loved having the family so close. She loved the coziness of it. She loved that we had built it together. My parents seemed lighter too. Like the weight that had been pressing down on them had lifted a little bit. They still had to work. They still had to manage finances. But they didn't have the anxiety of a mortgage hanging over their heads. They didn't have to worry about paying a landlord every month. The house was theirs. It was owned completely. There was no debt attached to it. Marcus went back to college, but he came home more often. I think because he wanted to be part of the community that we had built, because he wanted to check in on how we were doing and make sure we were okay. I started to process what had happened. I started to understand that what we had gone through wasn't a failure. It was a redirection. It was a change in course that ultimately led us somewhere better than where we were headed. It took me several months after we moved into the tiny house to really start processing the emotional impact of everything that had happened. The foreclosure, the fear, the 30-day sprint to build a house, all of it. And I realized something that I think is important to say out loud. Just because something worked out okay for us doesn't mean that everyone has the option to do what we did. Not everyone has grandparents with land that they can use. Not everyone has a parent who is skilled enough to oversee a construction project. Not everyone has a community that will show up and help. Not everyone has the capacity or the mental fortitude to take on something like this. I'm not saying our solution is the solution that everyone in foreclosure should pursue. I'm just saying that for us it was possible, and we found a way to do it. But I learned other things from that experience that I think are more universally applicable. I learned that crisis can either destroy you or transform you. You don't get to choose whether the crisis happens, but you do get to choose how you respond to it. My dad could have given up. He could have accepted defeat. He could have just tried to find an apartment to rent and moved on with his life, but instead he chose to see the crisis as an opportunity. He chose to think creatively about what was possible. He chose to refuse defeat. That choice made all the difference. I also learned that shame is a choice. I was so ashamed about what was happening to my family. I didn't want anyone to know that we were losing our house. I thought that it reflected something negative about us, about our work ethic, about our character. But over time, I realized that there was nothing to be ashamed of. We had faced a circumstance that was beyond our control, and we had handled it with integrity and creativity and love. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. I learned that community is real and it's powerful. When people showed up to help us, they were showing us that we mattered, that they cared about us, that we weren't alone, that's something you can't put a price on. That's something that actually changed how I see other people in crisis now. When I see someone who's struggling, I think about what we went through and I think about how much those acts of community mattered to us. And I try to be that person for other people. I learned that my parents are stronger than I thought they were. I had always known my parents as the people who took care of me, who provided for me, who made the decisions. But I didn't really understand how strong they were until they had to be strong in a way that mattered. Until they had to face something really difficult, and not just survive it, but actually build something new from it. I learned that I am stronger than I thought I was. I was so scared during that time. I was so small in my own way, but I showed up. I helped. I participated. I supported my family. And I discovered that I could do hard things, that I could be resilient, that I could face uncertainty and not fall apart. Living in the tiny house ended up being one of the best years of my life, which I think would have shocked me to hear if you had told me that during the foreclosure crisis. The space was small, but because it was small, we had to be intentional about how we used it. My mom and dad's bedroom was small, the kids' rooms were small, the kitchen was efficient, the living room was cozy, everything served a purpose. We ate dinner together every single night, not because we had a rule about it, but because there wasn't really room to eat dinner separately. So we sat at the table and we talked and we laughed and we heard about each other's days. I spent my senior year of high school while living in that tiny house. I did my homework there. I studied for my SATs there. I applied to colleges from the kitchen table. My mom started a garden on the property. She had always wanted to grow vegetables and herbs, but she had never had the space in our old house to really do it. Now she had acres of land to work with. She started composting. She started planting. She created this beautiful garden that eventually provided food for the family. My dad started working on carpentry projects on the weekends. He built raised garden beds for my mom. He built shelving for the bedrooms. He built a deck off the back of the house. He had rediscovered a love of building things that had gotten lost somewhere along the way in his work, managing construction projects for other people. Emma started photography. She would walk around the property with my dad's camera and take pictures of the trees and the garden and the sunset and the birds. She developed this whole creative skill just because she had time and space to explore it. Marcus came home and he brought his college friends sometimes, and those friends were amazed by what we had done. They were amazed by the tiny house and the land and the fact that we had built it ourselves. Some of them asked us if we could help them figure out how to do something similar. That was kind of wild, to think that our crisis and our solution could inspire other people to think differently about how they wanted to live. I made new friends in the area. The land was kind of remote, so school was a longer drive, but I still had friends from school and I also made friends with some local kids. And none of them cared that I lived in a tiny house. Some of them thought it was cool. The shame that I had felt, that had been so overwhelming during the foreclosure period, just kind of evaporated. Because I realized that how we lived was not a reflection of our worth. How we lived was just how we lived. And we were happy, we were together, we were safe, we were doing okay. I'm 17 now, and I'm graduated high school and getting ready to go to college. And I've been thinking a lot about what this experience has taught me and what I want to do with that knowledge. I want to study sustainable housing. I want to learn about affordable housing solutions. I want to be part of changing the system that puts families in the position we were in. I want to work on policy and design and community building so that the kind of crisis we experience doesn't destroy families the way it could have destroyed us. My dad's experience of building that tiny house in 30 days has actually become more well-known than I expected. He started consulting with other people who are interested in building affordable housing solutions. He's been asked to speak at a couple of community meetings about how we did what we did. He's discovered a whole community of people who are thinking about alternatives to traditional housing, and he's found his place in that community. My mom has launched her own small business. She started teaching people how to grow food and how to create more sustainable lifestyles. She's writing a blog about it. She's been interviewed by a local magazine. She's taken the experience of our crisis and she's turned it into something that helps other people. Even Marcus is affected by this. He's thinking about how his career choices might relate to housing and sustainability and community. He's talking about potentially getting involved in some non-profits that work on housing issues. And Emma, my little sister, is documenting the whole thing through her photography. She's created an Instagram account where she posts photos of the tiny house and the property and our life there, and she has thousands of followers. People are fascinated by how we live. And Emma is using her platform to talk about affordable housing and sustainable living, and the fact that you can lose everything and still build something beautiful. Our family's crisis has become our family's purpose in a way. I want to be honest about something though. Not everything after the tiny house was perfect. Not everything was a happy ending in the way that maybe this story might sound. There was a period where my parents' marriage was really strained. The stress of the foreclosure and the construction and the pressure had put a huge amount of strain on their relationship. My mom told me years later that there were times when she wasn't sure if they were going to make it. They went to marriage counseling. They worked through it, but it wasn't instant. It wasn't like everything was fine as soon as we moved into the tiny house. It took time, it took effort. It took both of them choosing to fight for the relationship. My dad experienced depression related to the whole situation. He felt guilt about what had happened, even though intellectually he understood that it wasn't his fault. He felt shame about not being able to provide for his family in the way he thought he should. He dealt with anxiety about money that took years to process. He's talked to me about it, and he said that even though the outcome was positive, the experience was traumatic. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's important to say that just because something worked out okay doesn't mean it wasn't painful in the moment. I also want to say that not all of the relationships that were strained during that time recovered. My parents had some friends who didn't support the decision to build the tiny house, who thought it was strange or reckless or indicative of some kind of breakdown. Those friendships faded. My mom had to grieve those losses even as she was building a new life. There was also the reality of the actual living situation. Living in such close quarters was hard sometimes. There were times when I was desperate for privacy and there was nowhere to go. There were times when someone was upset and there was no space to cool off. There were times when the family was too much and I wanted to escape but I couldn't. My parents also realized that as Emma and I got older, the tiny house that had felt so cozy when we were younger started to feel really cramped. They started to plan for a bigger structure. My dad started working on designs for a larger building that we could add to the property. They were thinking about the future and what would work for the family as we continued to grow and change. What I'm trying to say with all of this is that my story is not a simple story. It's not a story that starts with a problem and ends with a solution, and then everything is perfect forever. It's a story about a family that faced a real crisis and found a real creative solution and experienced real transformation, and also experienced real pain and real struggle along the way. And I think that's the most important part to share, because I see a lot of motivational content on the internet that presents life as if it's this linear path from bad to good, and that's not really how life works. But I also think it's important to say that my dad's choice to not give up, his choice to see the crisis as an opportunity, his choice to think creatively about what was possible, all of that did fundamentally change the trajectory of our family. We could have lost our house and spent years renting and struggling financially and never really recovering. That's a very real possibility that could have happened. My parents were at the age and stage of life where that could have derailed everything. Instead, my dad chose to do something radical and bold, and that choice created a foundation for our family that we have built everything else on top of. I'm not naive enough to think that everyone who faces foreclosure should or could do what we did, but I do think that everyone who faces a crisis has more agency than they might feel like they have in that moment. I think there are choices to be made. I think there are creative solutions that exist. I think it's worth exploring what those choices and solutions might be instead of just accepting what feels inevitable. I've been thinking about what advice I would give to someone who is going through what my family went through. Someone who is facing foreclosure or housing insecurity or financial crisis. First, I would say, don't go through this alone, talk to people. I kept everything inside for so long and it made everything feel so much heavier. When you share your burden with other people, it becomes lighter. You find out that you're not as alone as you thought you were. Second, I would say, don't be ashamed. There is no shame in struggling. There is no shame in not having enough money. The system is rigged. The economy is unpredictable. Bad things happen to good people who do everything right. This is not a reflection of your character or your worth. Third, I would say, think creatively about what's possible. Don't just accept what feels inevitable. Ask questions. Research alternatives. Talk to people who have faced similar situations. There might be solutions that you haven't considered yet. Fourth, I would say, take care of your relationships. Your family, your friends, your community, those are the things that matter. Financial crisis can strain relationships, but it can also strengthen them if you work at it. Make sure you're checking in with the people you love. Make sure you're expressing gratitude. Make sure you're not letting the crisis consume everything. Fifth, I would say, give yourself permission to feel scared. This is a scary thing. You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to cry. You're allowed to not be okay. You don't have to pretend that everything is fine. You can acknowledge how hard this is while also working towards solutions. Sixth, I would say, accept help when people offer it. I think there's a lot of cultural shame around accepting help, especially in America where we valorize independence and self-reliance. But human beings are communal creatures. We need each other. Accepting help is not a weakness. It's an acknowledgement of the reality of our interdependence. Seventh, I would say, remember that this is temporary. Right now might feel like it will last forever, but it won't. You will get through this. You will come out the other side. And you will probably be stronger and more resilient than you were before. It's been 2 years since we moved into the tiny house. I'm 17 and I'm about to start college in a few months. I've been accepted to several schools, and I'm still figuring out which one I want to attend. My family still lives in the tiny house, though my dad is in the process of building an addition. He's building a larger structure that will give us more space as the family continues to grow and change. But even with the addition, it won't be a traditional house. It will still be a more sustainable, more intentional way of living. My parents have recovered from the stress of the foreclosure. They're stronger now. They've processed the experience and they've extracted the lessons from it. My dad has built a whole new career path around sustainable housing and consulting. My mom's garden is producing enough food to supply the family for most of the year. My siblings are doing well. Marcus is in college studying business with an interest in non-profits. Emma is in high school and still taking photographs and documenting our life in the tiny house for her social media followers. And me, I'm preparing to go to college and study sustainable housing and affordable housing solutions. I'm planning to use what I learned from my family's experience to try to help solve some of the systemic issues that put families in situations like ours. I'm no longer ashamed of what happened to my family. I'm proud of how we handled it. I'm proud of my parents for refusing to give up. I'm proud of my siblings for supporting each other. I'm proud of being part of a family that chose to build something instead of being destroyed by something. There's one more thing I want to talk about before I wrap this up, and it's something that I don't see discussed very often in stories about overcoming adversity. It's the fact that my family had advantages that other families don't have. We had grandparents with land to give us. We had a father with construction and carpentry skills. We had a network of people who were willing to help. We had access to the resources and knowledge to build a house. We had white-collar jobs that allowed my parents to take time off to work on the house. We had the financial cushion from my grandparents to help with the initial costs. Not everyone has these advantages. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when I'm telling this story of overcoming, because the reality is that if my family hadn't had those advantages, our story probably would have ended differently. We probably would have become homeless. We probably would have struggled for years to get back on our feet. We probably would have experienced a completely different kind of trauma. So I'm not telling this story as if it's a blueprint that anyone can follow. I'm telling it as a story of what's possible when you have certain resources and certain advantages, and you choose to use them creatively. But I'm also saying that the system shouldn't be set up so that only families with certain advantages can escape homelessness. The system should be set up so that everyone has access to housing and everyone has support when they're in crisis. My dad talks about this sometimes. He says that what happened to our family could happen to any family, that there are millions of families living on the edge, one job loss or one medical emergency or one economic downturn away from homelessness. And those families don't all have grandparents with land. They don't all have construction skills. They don't all have communities that will show up and help. So while I'm proud of what my family accomplished, I'm also aware that we were lucky. We were fortunate. We had advantages that made our solution possible. I'm going to end with this. My life at 16 felt like it was falling apart. I thought losing my house meant losing everything. I thought that the end of my childhood home meant the end of security and stability and normal life. But what I learned is that a house is not a home. A home is the people. A home is the values. A home is the love and the support and the connection that you have with the people who matter most to you. My family's home didn't change when we moved from the big house to the tiny house. My family's home was wherever we were together. And that home actually became stronger and more intentional and more real when we had to build it literally and figuratively. My dad didn't just save us from homelessness. He saved us by refusing to let the crisis define us. He saved us by thinking creatively and boldly. He saved us by believing that things could be different. He saved us by getting to work and doing the hard thing instead of accepting the easy defeat. And in doing that, he taught me something that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life. He taught me that you have more power than you think you do, that your circumstances don't have to define your future, that you can take something terrible and transform it into something meaningful. That when everything seems impossible, that's actually when the most interesting possibilities emerge. I don't know what my life would have looked like if we hadn't lost that house. I don't know if I would have become the person I am now if I hadn't gone through that experience. But I know that I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the crisis and the fear and the hard work and the transformation that came out of it. At 16, I lost my home when the bank took it. But what my dad did next didn't just save us, it transformed us. And that's a debt I can never repay, but I can try to honor by living a life that's true to the lessons he taught me. By helping other families find their way through their own crises. By working toward a world where no family has to experience what we experienced. And by remembering always that the home is not the building. The home is the people. And that home is worth fighting for. That's my story, and I'm grateful every single day that I get to live it. If you're listening right now and you're in the middle of your own crisis, I want to tell you something directly. What you're going through is hard, it's really hard, and I'm sorry that you're going through it. I'm sorry that the system is set up in such a way that people can lose their homes. I'm sorry that financial security is so fragile for so many people. I'm sorry that you're scared. But I also want to tell you that there is hope. Not the kind of hope that's naive or unrealistic, but the kind of hope that's grounded in the fact that humans are resilient, that communities can come together, that creative solutions exist even when they're hard to see, that this moment, as hard as it is not permanent, that you will get through this. Your circumstances do not define your worth. Your financial situation does not determine your character. The fact that you're struggling does not mean you've failed. It means you're human and you're living in a system that is designed to make survival difficult for many people. But you're here, you're listening, you're thinking about solutions, you're trying, and that's what matters. That's the thing that will get you through. So I'm going to leave you with the same thing my dad told us when everything was falling apart. You have the power to change your story, not by ignoring the hard parts, not by pretending everything is fine, but by showing up, by thinking creatively, by asking for help, by refusing to give up, and by believing that something different is possible. Your story doesn't have to end in homelessness. It doesn't have to end in defeat. It might end in a tiny house on land your grandparents own. It might end in an apartment that's more affordable than you thought possible. It might end in a completely different solution that you haven't even thought of yet. But it doesn't have to end in the tragedy that you're afraid of. So keep going, keep fighting, keep hopping, keep building. And know that somewhere, there's a woman who lost her home at 16 and survived it and went on to have a life that was meaningful and full, and shaped by that experience in beautiful ways. You can too.